"Get away from my boat!" I screamed, my lungs burning as I sprinted toward the dock. The flames had already engulfed Liberty's bow, my pride and joy of 15 years now crackling and hissing as the fire consumed her. Through the wall of orange flames, I saw Margaret Wilson, our HOA president, standing motionless in the shadows, her face illuminated by the inferno. The satisfaction in her eyes told me everything I needed to know. This wasn't an accident. She thought she'd finally broken me, forced me out of Lakeview Estates after months of harassment. What she didn't realize was that by destroying my boat, she had ignited something far more dangerous than fiberglass and gasoline. I wasn't just any homeowner she could bully into submission. I was James Foster, former legal counsel for the state attorney's office, specialized in corporate fraud. And tonight, Margaret Wilson had made the biggest mistake of her life. By morning, I would legally freeze every bank account, suspend every board member, and halt all operations of the Lakeview Estates Homeowners Association. The predator was about to become the prey. When I purchased my lakefront property at Lakeview Estates 6 months ago, I was looking for peace after 20 stressful years as a prosecutor. The serene waterfront view and the space to dock Liberty, my 30-foot sailboat, seemed perfect for the next chapter of my life. The trouble started 3 weeks after I moved in. A notice appeared on my door citing aesthetic violations regarding Liberty. According to the citation, my plain white vessel does not conform to the classic style of the community lake area. It was ridiculous, but I politely filed the appropriate response forms, assuming it was just bureaucratic nonsense. Then came a second notice. And a third. Each one more absurd than the last. Boat height exceeds community guidelines by 7.5 inches. Watercraft creates unacceptable shadow patterns on communal waters. Non-conforming nautical fixtures visible from community pathways. I began collecting these notices methodically, sensing a pattern. This wasn't random HOA pettiness, it was targeted harassment. My first direct encounter with Margaret Wilson came during my second month at the monthly HOA meeting. She commanded the room without effort, perfectly coiffed silver hair, tailored pantsuit, and a voice that could either charm or cut depending on her mood. As president of this association for 9 years running, she announced with practiced grace, "I've ensured Lakeview maintains the highest property values in the county. We don't achieve that by allowing just anyone to do just anything." The way her eyes lingered on me made my skin crawl. Several residents nodded along, particularly Thomas Reynolds, a man whose eagerness to agree with Margaret bordered on comical. After the meeting, my neighbor Emily Chen approached me discreetly. "Be careful with Margaret," she whispered. "She has a way of making life difficult for people who don't fall in line, especially those with lakefront properties." I should have taken her warning more seriously. 3 months in, I discovered deep scratches along Liberty's hull one morning, deliberate gouges that exposed the fiberglass beneath the paint. The marina security camera footage showed Thomas Reynolds circling my boat at 2:15 a.m., something metallic glinting in his hand. The damage required immediate repairs costing nearly $3,000. When confronted, Thomas merely suggested, "Neighborhood kids must be responsible," despite the clear evidence to the contrary. I began researching the HOA's financial records, which were suspiciously opaque. The Community Maintenance Fund showed substantial deposits yet minimal expenditures. Meanwhile, I learned Margaret owned Wilson Development Group, specializing in luxury waterfront properties. The connection wasn't yet clear, but my investigative instincts were screaming. My inquiries caught the attention of Sarah Jacobs, an investigative reporter who had been tracking suspicious HOA activities across the county. "You're not the first person to clash with Margaret Wilson," she informed me over coffee at a shop well away from Lakeview. "But most critics mysteriously withdraw their complaints after a few weeks of pressure." She showed me a pattern of waterfront property acquisitions in 3 different communities, all preceded by aggressive HOA enforcement actions that led homeowners to sell at significant losses. The buyer? Shell companies linked to Wilson Development Group. "She's using the HOA as a weapon," Sarah explained. "Targeting properties she wants, making owners' lives hell until they sell cheap, then flipping them for massive profits." Armed with this knowledge, I began building a case, carefully documenting every violation notice, recording every interaction with the HOA board, and installing security cameras covering my property in Liberty. Margaret's campaign intensified. I received violation notices almost daily, noise complaints when I had no visitors, landscaping citations for plants that had been there since before I purchased the property, even a claim that my mailbox was 5/8 of an inch taller than regulation. The psychological warfare was calculated, but I'd faced down organized crime bosses and corporate fraud masterminds. Margaret Wilson, for all her local influence, was an amateur by comparison. The week before Liberty was destroyed, I received an official notice requiring her immediate removal from Lakeview waters within 48 hours due to emergency environmental regulations. The document referenced a board meeting I knew nothing about. I immediately filed a formal objection with the County Housing Authority, copying every HOA board member individually to ensure Margaret couldn't intercept it. I included documentation proving the emergency meeting that enacted these regulations had violated at least 4 separate bylaws. Thomas called that evening, his voice strained. "You're making a serious mistake challenging her directly," he warned. "Margaret doesn't lose. Ever." I spent that night on Liberty, unwilling to leave her vulnerable. The lake was peaceful, moonlight creating a silver path across the water. Around 2 a.m. I finally dozed off, only to be awakened at dawn by Emily pounding on the hull. "James, there's an emergency board meeting happening right now at Margaret's house. They're voting on immediate removal action for your boat." By the time I arrived at Margaret's residence, the group was dispersing. Robert Sullivan, a retired judge and reluctant board member, caught my eye and subtly shook his head. Whatever vote had occurred hadn't gone in my favor. The enforcement notice arrived by courier 3 hours later. Liberty would be physically removed at my expense within 24 hours if I didn't relocate her outside Lakeview waters. I faced an impossible choice. Moving Liberty would surrender to Margaret's unlawful demands, potentially weakening any future legal claims. Standing my ground risked physical damage during a forced removal. Either way, Margaret would achieve her immediate goal of clearing the lakefront view from my property. That night, I walked down to check on Liberty one last time. The dock was quiet, the water glass smooth under a nearly full moon. I had just finished securing an additional line when headlights appeared at the parking area above the dock. 2 figures emerged, one unmistakably Margaret, the other Thomas. They didn't see me in the shadows of the boathouse. Their whispered conversation carried across the still air. "Just make it look like an electrical problem," Margaret was saying. "Insurance companies never investigate those thoroughly." I froze, unable to believe what I was hearing. What happened next unfolded with nightmarish speed. While Margaret returned to her car, Thomas approached Liberty with a gas can. I started running, shouting for him to stop, but panic made him act faster. The accelerant splashed across Liberty's deck, and the match was struck before I could reach them. The flames caught instantly, spreading with terrifying hunger across the fiberglass and wood. Margaret's car peeled away as Thomas dropped the evidence and ran. I tried desperately to reach the fire extinguisher inside the cabin, but the heat drove me back. Within minutes, Liberty was an inferno against the night sky, flames reflecting in the dark water like some hellish mirror. The fire department arrived 15 minutes later, but by then Liberty was already sinking, flames still licking what remained above water. I stood on the dock, soaked and shaking, watching 15 years of memories disappear beneath the surface. By morning, Margaret had already shaped the narrative. The official report cited probable electrical malfunction, despite the obvious smell of gasoline. When I filed a police report naming Margaret and Thomas as suspects, the responding officer, who I later learned had attended 3 of Margaret's fundraising galas, was noticeably skeptical. That evening, standing at the shore, I discovered a charred piece of Liberty's woodwork with a handwritten note attached. "Your dream doesn't belong here." The message couldn't have been clearer. But neither was my response. I didn't sleep that night. Instead, I reviewed everything I had learned about Margaret Wilson and her operation. The pieces suddenly aligned with crystal clarity. This wasn't just about my boat or even my property. This was about a systematic criminal enterprise using HOA authority as a weapon for personal enrichment. At dawn, I contacted Rachel Martinez, the HOA treasurer who I'd noticed seemed uncomfortable during board meetings. We met at a coffee shop 20 miles from Lakeview. "I know Margaret is blackmailing you," I said quietly. Her eyes widened, but she didn't deny it. "Whatever she has on you, I can promise you it's not worth being an accomplice to criminal fraud." Rachel's hands trembled around her coffee cup. "She has documents showing my husband borrowed from the HOA emergency fund years ago when he got sick. We paid it back, but she altered the records to make it look like we never did. I need access to the HOA financial records, all of them," I told her. "Not just what's shown at meetings." She hesitated, then reached into her bag and handed me a USB drive. "I've been keeping copies. I should have done this years ago." What I found when I analyzed those files exceeded my worst expectations. For 9 years, Margaret had been systematically diverting HOA funds into consulting services provided by shell companies she controlled. Special assessments for community improvements had been collected repeatedly with no corresponding expenditures. Most damning was evidence that Margaret had privately purchased options on adjacent undeveloped land, then used HOA resources to enhance its value. The emergency environmental regulations used against Liberty were never about protection. They were about clearing the view for a luxury condominium development that would net Margaret millions. But buried in the association's founding documents, I discovered something Margaret had tried to erase. Section 7.4 of the original charter contained an emergency provision that allowed any homeowner to request financial auditing and temporary suspension of all HOA operations upon presenting evidence of serious misconduct. This forgotten clause would be my nuclear option. At 8 a.m., I filed formal complaints with the County Housing Authority, the District Attorney's Office, and the state's Attorney General simultaneously. I included comprehensive evidence of financial fraud, procedural violations, and criminal conspiracy. By 9:30 a.m., I had hand-delivered copies to every board member except Margaret and Thomas, along with a formal invocation of Section 7.4 of the Charter. By 10:15 a.m., I had submitted emergency injunction requests to 3 separate courts. By noon, county officials had approved the temporary freezing of all HOA bank accounts pending investigation. By 2 p.m., the district attorney's office had assigned an investigator specializing in financial crimes. At 3 p.m., as Margaret was chairing an emergency board meeting attempting to rally support, county officials arrived with a cease and desist order halting all HOA operations effective immediately. The timing wasn't coincidental. I had made sure Rachel would tip me off about any emergency meetings. Margaret's face as the officials entered was something I'll never forget. Confusion transitioning to disbelief, then to cold fury as she realized what was happening. "This is preposterous," she sputtered. "Foster is simply retaliating because he couldn't follow simple community guidelines." I stood then, addressing not Margaret but the assembled residents. For 9 years, our community has operated under increasingly arbitrary rules that benefit one person's private business interests. The money we've contributed for improvements has been systematically diverted. The harassment I've experienced, culminating in the destruction of my property, was never about community standards. It was about forcing out lakefront owners so certain parties could redevelop our properties for personal profit. I distributed copies of the financial evidence to every attendee, watching as realization dawned across the room. The stunned silence was broken by Robert Sullivan. "I move that we immediately suspend the current board pending investigation results." Margaret's counterattack was swift and desperate. "This is defamation. You'll be hearing from my attorneys." But her threats rang hollow against the documentary evidence now circulating throughout the room. The county officials explained that all HOA financial activities were frozen for 30 days under state law provisions while the investigation proceeded. Margaret stormed out, phone already at her ear, leaving behind a community beginning to awaken from years of intimidation. The initial audit findings exceeded even my expectations. Approximately $2.3 million had been diverted from Lakeview's accounts over 9 years through a sophisticated system of fraudulent vendors and inflated invoices. Sarah Jacobs's resulting newspaper article, HOA Horror, The Systematic Exploitation of Lakeview Estates, brought countywide attention to our situation and sparked investigations into similar patterns at other associations. 3 days into the investigation, Margaret made one final desperate move. She appeared at my door at 9:30 p.m., clutching a thick envelope. "How much do you need to disappear?" Her voice was sweet as poison. When I refused her initial offer of $100,000, her composure cracked completely. "You have no idea who you're dealing with," she hissed. "I've crushed people far more significant than you." What followed was a remarkable self-destruction, a 15-minute monologue of threats, admissions, and ultimately a complete confession that I recorded in its entirety on my phone. "Of course I had that floating eyesore removed," she spat when I mentioned Liberty. "It was blocking the primary view corridor for the lakeside development. Do you have any idea what waterfront property is worth once properly developed? Your precious boat was standing in the way of a $40 million project." 2 police officers arrived within minutes of my emergency call, finding Margaret still ranting about her thwarted plans. The recording provided the final evidence needed, a clear confession to orchestrating Liberty's destruction, along with admissions of financial fraud and abuse of HOA authority. As they led her away in handcuffs, the realization of what she'd done seemed to finally register on her face. The composed, controlling community leader was gone, replaced by someone frantically calculating how to escape consequences that had now become inevitable. The Lakeview community gathered for an emergency meeting the following day, a cathartic moment when residents openly discussed years of intimidation and manipulation. Property owners who had suffered in silence for years finally felt safe enough to share their experiences. When questions about leadership arose, several residents nominated me to head the transition committee. I declined, suggesting instead a governance council with Robert Sullivan as chairman. Our community doesn't need another central authority figure, I explained. We need transparent, distributed leadership focused on actual community needs. The district attorney's press conference announced charges against not just Margaret and Thomas, but 7 other associates involved in the scheme. This investigation has uncovered what appears to be one of the most sophisticated real estate fraud schemes in state history, she explained. We're currently tracking financial connections to development companies in 3 states. As the case expanded, our community began the difficult process of rebuilding trust and establishing legitimate governance. The homeowners voted unanimously to terminate all existing violation notices and begin fresh evaluations based on transparently created standards. For the first time in years, people spoke openly at meetings without fear of retribution. The reign of terror had ended, but the healing was just beginning. Margaret's preliminary hearing painted a damning picture. The prosecution presented overwhelming evidence of financial fraud, property destruction, and abuse of authority. Her attorney's attempts to characterize the situation as overzealous community management collapsed under the weight of financial records, witness testimony, and Margaret's own recorded confessions. The judge denied bail, citing flight risk and the discovery of recently purchased international tickets. As she was led from the courtroom, Margaret locked eyes with me briefly, her expression a mixture of hatred and, unexpectedly, respect. She had underestimated her opponent, a miscalculation that had cost her everything. The transformation of Lakeview in the following weeks was remarkable to witness. Neighbors who had barely acknowledged each other for years began organizing impromptu gatherings, block parties, gardening exchanges, even a community cleanup day for the lakefront. These weren't official HOA functions but organic expressions of a community rediscovering itself. During one such gathering, a resident who had lived in perpetual fear of citations under Margaret's regime tearfully shared how she had finally planted the flower garden she'd always wanted. A small act of liberation that symbolized the larger change occurring within our community. Robert's collaborative leadership style facilitated this healing process. Rather than issuing directives, he established monthly community forums where residents could voice concerns directly. When architectural or landscaping issues arose, the emphasis shifted from rigid enforcement to supportive problem-solving. Where neighbors first, property owners second, became his guiding principle, a radical departure from Margaret's approach. Rachel Martinez, serving as Financial Transparency Officer, implemented comprehensive reforms, publishing detailed monthly reports accessible to all residents. The community's relief was palpable. People moved through shared spaces with noticeably less tension, as if collectively exhaling after years of holding their breath. The settlement from Margaret's insurance company and the HOA's liability policy covered not only Liberty's replacement value but substantial punitive damages. The community voted to use recovered misappropriated funds to build a new community dock accessible to all residents, regardless of property location. Sarah and I established a legal resource network for victims of HOA overreach, providing consultation and representation for homeowners facing similar situations throughout the county. What happened at Lakeview isn't unique, Sarah explained at our first community workshop. Homeowners associations control over 74 million properties nationwide, often with minimal oversight. Education is our best defense against abuse. Her investigative series expanded into a county-wide examination of HOA governance, identifying problematic patterns and highlighting communities successfully implementing democratic practices. Together, we were building a movement focused on reclaiming these organizations for their original purpose, supporting communities rather than controlling them. The ripple effects of our story spread far beyond Lakeview's boundaries. Neighboring communities began reviewing their own HOA structures, with several implementing versions of our transparency reforms. County officials, embarrassed by the regulatory failures exposed in our case, established an oversight committee specifically focused on homeowners associations. Most significantly, state legislators introduced a bill, informally dubbed the Liberty Act, strengthening homeowner protections against predatory HOA practices. What had begun as one person's stand against injustice was catalyzing systemic change that would potentially benefit thousands of families. 6 months after the fire, I stood on the newly completed community dock, watching as a crane carefully lowered my new sailboat into the water. I had christened her Phoenix, perhaps too obvious a symbolism, but fitting nonetheless. Nearly the entire community had gathered for the occasion. Children played along the shore while adults shared food and conversation, the atmosphere more reminiscent of a family reunion than a formal event. Robert approached, offering a handshake that turned into an unexpected hug. "You know, when you first moved in, Margaret told everyone you'd be trouble," he chuckled. She was right, just not in the way she meant. As Phoenix settled into the water, gleaming white against the blue lake, Emily raised her glass. "To liberty lost and freedom found," she toasted, her voice carrying across the gathered crowd. The response was unanimous. Glasses raised, voices joined in celebration not just of a new boat but of a community reborn. Later, as twilight settled over the lake, I sailed Phoenix in a wide circle around the cove. From the water, I could see Lakeview transformed, no longer a collection of houses ruled by fear, but a true community shaped by shared values and mutual respect. The destruction of liberty had been devastating, but from those ashes had risen something unexpected: a stronger community, reformed governance, and a new purpose. I had moved to Lakeview seeking peace after years of fighting corruption and found instead a battle worth fighting. Sarah joined me on deck, reviewing notes for her upcoming book about HOA reform. "Ready for the next chapter?" she asked, gesturing toward a folder containing information about similar cases in neighboring counties. I smiled, feeling the wind fill the sails, just as purpose had filled the void left by liberty's loss. "Sometimes when life burns what you love," I replied, "something even more beautiful can rise from the ashes." As Phoenix sailed across the same waters where liberty had been destroyed, I realized the most important lesson from this ordeal. Dreams can be rebuilt, but only if we're willing to fight for them. The woman who tried to break me had instead revealed a strength I hadn't known I possessed. And that, perhaps, was the greatest victory of all.